Okay, so it's just 2 o'clock. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Nee, and I am a volunteer on CFA Society Vancouver's program committee. We are delighted to collaborate with our colleagues from CFA Society Victoria and CFA Society Okanagan to host this presentation. It is my pleasure to welcome you all and thank you for joining us. I will now pass the baton to Kwame Boateng from CFA Society Okanagan to facilitate further introductions. Over to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this presentation of 2020 GIPS standards, why be compliant and how to adopt. As Rachel said, my name is Kwame Boateng. I am the president of CFA Society Okanagan, and I'll be kicking things off with a couple brief words. Firstly, I'd like to note, as Rachel said, that this event is a joint collaborative effort between CFA Societies Vancouver, Victoria, and the Okanagan, so the BC societies. Representing Victoria on the call is my colleague David Masden at Scotiabank, and representing Vancouver is Rachel, who you just heard from. This type of event is not something that we've typically been able to do with the collaborative aspect, but given the environment that we're in and being able to leverage the digital technologies that we have, we've been able to further enhance our respective value propositions to our membership by providing something like this. So I would like to thank each society for their role in helping make this event be what it was. And especially I would like to thank CFA Society Vancouver for hosting us. So that's item number one. Item number two, a couple of housekeeping rules. Now we're a year and some change into Zooming every day, so I'm sure you have heard this before, but I just want to reiterate so that we're all on the same page. Firstly, this video is going to be recorded for future viewing, so stay tuned after the event to see how to get access to said recording if you want to revisit a couple topics. Secondly, we will be hosting a Q&A after this event is completed, and it's going to be moderated by my colleague David. So questions can be typed in the chat function below. You can either message David directly or you can ask questions to the group, and we'll be moderating that throughout the entire conversation and then having that discussed during the Q&A. And lastly, you already know this probably, but make sure you try to keep your mics muted where you can, and video functions have been disabled. If that has not been the case, then please do make sure to turn off your videos so we can focus on the panelists. Now, for the actual event and why you're here. So as you're all very well aware, this new version of the Global Investment Performance Standards came into effect January 1st of last year. Now, these updates from the prior iteration give more guidance and measures and clarity on performance standards for pool funds and other things like that. With us today to discuss these updates and why they are important for you to know is our panel of esteemed GIPS experts. And I'm just going to start it off in terms of how it was kind of written on the invitation. Starting off with Simon Filteau. He is the VP of Valuations and Performance at CDPQ, and he is also the chair of the Canadian Investment Performance Council. We also have Patrick Fontaine. He is a process lead in investment analytics at Fiera Capital, also serving on the Canadian Investment Performance Council. Emile Vassanin, he is president and principal of EVIP Group Inc., and this is Canada's largest GIPS consulting and verification firm. And last but definitely not least, we have Ken Robinson. Ken is a director in the Global Industry Standards team at CFA Institute, so the mothership. So all of these gentlemen, big cheese. I can't stress this enough. This is an absolutely stacked panel. So I'm going to let them get right into it. Kevin or Ken, I'll turn things over to you, and I'll go off video here. Ken.
Great, thanks, Kwame. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thanks for having us. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start off by thanking the Vancouver, the Victoria, and Okanagan societies. Hope I pronounced that right. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the background of the GIPS standards. Then Simon is going to follow after me and talk about the GIPS standards for asset owners. Emil and Patrick are going to tag team it and talk a little bit about the GIPS standards for firms. Emil will come back and do verification. I'll do resources. And then David will assist us in going through the Q&As. Our goal is to have about 60 minutes of content and 15 minutes of Q&As. Keep in mind with the GIPS standards, if you don't work with it every day like some of us do, this is one of those topics where we can spend a week talking about it. So we try to make this, high level. We can't cover all the relevant points. So, there's going to be no quiz or anything like that. Key thing for you, I think, for you all to know is, to the extent you have a question, either, during our presentation tomorrow or even a year from now, we're here for you. Feel free to use any of us as a resource. Our contacts is listed on one of the later slides in the slide deck, and you will get a copy of the slide deck after the presentation. So with that, let's begin. I am going to stop my video as I need to save some bandwidth from my location. And okay, so what are the GIPS standards? Well, the CFA, the Global Investment Performance Standards, otherwise known as the GIPS standards, are an investment industry standard for both calculating and presenting historical investment performance. The standards are administered by CFA Institute, but we don't just write the standards ourselves. We put together the standards through a large collaborative process, and that largely entails a whole host of volunteers from the investment management community. As you may know, we have quite a few what we call GIPS standards committees, which represent the perspectives of our volunteers with diverse backgrounds that include asset owners, managers, service providers, legal, compliance, that sort of thing. So for example, we have a GIPS standards committee for asset owners, investment managers. We have a bunch of technical committees as well. Once a year, we solicit nominations to be on these committees, and it just so happens that we're during that time period. So I just wanted to mention, if anyone has an inkling or a desire to get involved, feel free to put your hat in the ring, so to speak. You can go to our website, gipsstandards.org, or reach out to me, and I'm happy to provide you information on doing that. Applications to be on any of our GIPS standards committees are due on May 15th at 5 p.m. US Eastern Time. I know that's weird that I give you the time, but you do have to submit it by, believe it or not, by exactly that time. And we're always looking for new blood, if you will, to get involved with the GIPS standards. We also have what's called GIPS standard sponsors. There are over 40 GIPS, well, I should say we have GIPS standard sponsors in over 40 markets, markets being generally countries, and that's comprised of 60 not-for-profit organizations. And these entities work in their local market to both promote the GIPS standards and to provide technical input from their local market perspective. We also work with numerous industry associations as we put together and we update the standards. And that could be, like private equity, ILPA, real estate, NACREIF, those types of organizations. Anything that we issue, the standards themselves, and if we are going to propose a new requirement or a recommendation, goes out for public comment. And so anyone could, have input on that, and it's not unusual for us to make changes based upon the public comment process. For all major items going out for public comment, including the 2020 GIPS standards themselves, like a lot of organizations, we'll release what's called an adopting release, where we acknowledge the major comments that we receive, and we'll articulate, why we agree or disagree with that particular comment and any changes that were necessary in the final document. So if you enter that type of thing, all the adopting releases are housed on our website, gipsstandards.org. 24 of the top 25, 39 of the top 40, and 86 of the top 100 global investment managers, either in whole or in part, choose to claim compliance with the standards. In Canada, that entails almost 70 entities, which comprise both investment management firms and asset owners that choose to claim compliance with the standards. But I don't want you to think that the standards themselves are just meant for the big boys, if you will, or the large, well-known investment management firms. Over 1,800 entities currently claim compliance with the standards. And believe it or not, the majority of those are small to medium-sized firms. And that represents across 48 markets, again, primarily countries where the 1,800 firms are housed, if you will. And the majority, probably the vast majority of that, are in the Americas region. So by establishing standardized requirements for both calculating and presenting investment performance, it allows the prospective investor or the asset owner, if you will, to compare investment performance for a given strategy between more than one investment manager. So you know, or they know, if you will, they're comparing apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges. And asset owners obviously play an important role. We'll talk a little bit more about asset owners as we go through the presentation. So I mentioned GIPS standard sponsors. Here's the latest list of GIPS standard sponsors across the world. I just want to point out that in some jurisdictions, you'll notice that there's more than one organization that is or makes up the GIPS standard sponsor. Where we have more than one organization that would like to promote the standards, we set it up so they would join forces and promote the standards collectively for that particular jurisdiction, and that works quite well. The only real requirement that we have to be a GIPS standard sponsor is that that entity needs to be a not-for-profit association, obviously not knowledgeable about the investment management industry and the GIPS standards in general. In Canada, that's the Canadian Investment Performance Council, which works with CFA Societies Canada to constitute the GIPS standards country sponsor. And surprise, surprise, we have a slide just for what's called the CIPC. Some of these names may look familiar, as Simon and Patrick and Emil, so all my co-presenters today are members of the CIPC, and I'm sure we probably have some CIPC members from Vancouver and British Columbia on our webinar today, so thank you for joining us. The CIPC promotes the standards throughout Canada. They have a website, so if you haven't seen it, please take a look at it. We put the link to the website on the slide. There you can see what the CIPC has been up to, as well as find some Canadian-specific resources. If you have an interest in getting involved with the CIPC, there's information on that on the CIPC website as well. There's even a LinkedIn page. So again, take a look at that and feel free to get involved. And again, the more people that get involved with investment performance, the better. And it goes without saying, feel free to reach out to Simon, Patrick, or Emil if you want to get involved with the CIPC. And okay, so you may ask, why did we decide to update the GIPS standards if over 1,800 entities comply? And I would say, great question. But we wanted to make the standards more relevant for alternative investment managers. We found over the years that the entities, or the percentage of entities by asset class that comply, were pretty high, with the exception of alternative investment managers. We did okay with real estate, not so much with private equity and hedge funds. And so as we embarked to update the GIPS standards, we reached out to a lot of our volunteers that worked for alternative investment managers, as well as to alternative investment manager associations, such like AIA, SBAI, ELPA, I mentioned NACREIF earlier, et cetera. We really wanted to know what we got right, anything that we thought they got wrong, and we wanted their input as to what we could do better with respect to alternative investments. And so we took their feedback into account when we updated the 2020 GIPS standards. Another big reason we wanted to update the standards was for pooled vehicles. We felt that pooled vehicles did not neatly fit into what's called the composite structure, which I think Emil will probably talk about when he talks about the GIPS standards for firms. But basically, we had required historically someone that would just market a pooled fund to put that into what we call a composite, which did not always make sense. And so now we have separate provisions within the GIPS standards themselves, both for pooled vehicles and for composites. And so for those firms that offer pooled vehicles, which we know is very prevalent in the alternative asset arena, there are now provisions just for pooled vehicles. In addition, we wanted to make the standards easier to follow for asset owners, and we'll talk a little bit more about asset owners in a minute. And then, of course, we wanted to consolidate our guidance since the last time we updated the standards themselves, which was back in 2010. Now the standards are really comprised of 3 chapters, if you will. Chapters are what we're calling them. I tend to call them books, if you will. So historically, there was 1 book. Now there are 3. There's a GIPS standards for firms that Emil will be speaking about. Asset owners, Simon will be speaking about. And so historically, you'd kind of have to flip between the sections and figure out what was relevant for firms and what was relevant for asset owners. But going forward now, you would just look at the GIPS standards that's applicable for you, whether it's GIPS standards for firms or GIPS standards for asset owners. We also consolidated all our verification guidance, which quite frankly was all over the place. And we put that into the GIPS standards for verifiers. We also updated the existing verification guidance as well. And Emil will be talking later about what a verification is, but now there's a GIPS standards for verifiers as well. I also want to mention that the standards themselves and all accompanying guidance is available at no charge on our website, gipsstandards.org. If you are so inclined to have a hard copy, you could print it out from the PDF or for our website, or there's a link where you can purchase it for a nominal charge. I think it's like $4 or $5 US each on Amazon if you really want the hard copy. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Simon, who's going to take us through the GIPS standards for asset owners.
Great. Thanks, Ken. And special thank you to societies of Okanagan, Vancouver, and Victoria as well for this opportunity and just a chance to discuss GIPS and investment performance. So just for a bit of a context, my job at CDPQ is to manage the performance and valuation teams. So CDPQ is an asset owner overseeing over 360 billion of assets on behalf of around 40 clients, mainly public retirement funds and insurance plans. And about 90% of our assets are managed in-house in both public and private markets. So we can see that on this slide, yes, that's the first one, perfect, that most of the other Canadian asset owners, we fit very well within the definition of CF Institute of what an asset owner is, which is basically any organization that invests on behalf of beneficiaries and that is accountable to an oversight body responsible to set investment policy and monitor performance. But outside of pension funds, we have a list as well on this slide of other types of asset owners that are active in Canada and around the world, just like foundations, sovereign funds, and all of those asset owners types can claim compliance to GIPS. And it's interesting as well to note here that the GIPS 2020 offers some additional flexibility. So for most typical asset owners reporting to oversight bodies, the reporting must be done in compliance with the asset owner standards, just like Ken mentioned, the asset owner book. But for asset owners that are also competing for business, like expanding the client base, outside of the pensions that are required to invest within that specific asset owner, the GIPS reporting must be in compliance with the investment firm standards. If we look at the next slide, we have a great example on how asset owners can use the GIPS standards for two main purposes. So first, during the investment decision process, and second, during the performance reporting at year-end. So during the selection process of external managers, the portfolio managers will work with the consultants to screen for compliance to GIPS, and often GIPS verification as well. And that really gives, it's basically the same process at CDPQ, so that really gives us the confidence in the performance numbers and the use of best practices in performance calculation and other processes like benchmark selection. So this is very useful, and I'll go into a bit more detail later on. Then on the right side of the slide, well, you see how the asset owners can also claim compliance for themselves, including, of course, all the asset under discretionary management, and then use this great tool to report to different oversight bodies like members of the board, the clients, and the general public. So we have a short list, the next slide, perfect, that are some of the asset owners around the world that are complying, some large, some smaller. And it's interesting to note that the first one on the list, AIA, is a large life insurance group who just became the first asset owner in Asia Pacific to adopt GIPS standards. They recently published with CFA Institute a great case study about their journey to become compliant. So that might be a good resource for anyone interested. On my side, CDPQ is GIPS compliant for 20 years now. We've adopted the first, we adopted the standards first in the early 2000s when they were named the AMR-PPS. I worked on the transition to GIPS in 2006, then to GIPS 2010, and just last year we adopted the new version of GIPS 2020. We also go through the recommended GIPS verification process annually, which is a great way to get an external view on the standards and make sure we have cohesion to our methodologies, the processes, and the documentation. And I think Emil will speak a bit more about verification later on. On to the next slide. So we see that many major and smaller asset owners around the world are complying with GIPS. But for the ones that are not, the question is why take on this project and why now? Well, you know, asset owners have always been able to claim compliance, but maybe because the GIPS standards were originally designed for investment managers, I think many asset owners were not aware that the standards could apply to them, or maybe struggled to understand as well how to work with the provisions that were not originally designed for them. So now with the dedicated book for asset owners and specific provision, adoption is really easier and really offers some specific benefits. First, compliance. Being compliant really helps to make sure that the performance is complete and fairly represented. Then it demonstrates a commitment to follow the global industry standards and best practice for valuation, performance calculation, and performance presentation. This part about valuation is very relevant for Canadian asset owners because we typically invest in large part and in large allocation to private assets like real estate, infrastructure, private equity. And as we all know, fair valuation is crucial to get representative performance. So it's very helpful to have GIPS guidelines to help us into that are tying valuation and performance. It's very helpful for us. Third benefit of compliance is that it requires establishment of robust investment performance policies and procedures. So it allows management to be extremely confident about performance. And it also gives an additional level of confidence to the board and to clients. And finally, it demonstrates a commitment to adopt the same principle as may be required of external management, the managers that would be hired for some of the external portfolios. And in my case, I could add as well that from my experience, the adoption of GIPS is helping creating a solid culture and knowledge base around performance in the organization. So this is really helpful for multiple discussions around, just an example, benchmark selection, maybe compensation programs, and or just assessments of some investment strategies. On the next slide, we present some perspective when hiring external managers. So as I was mentioning, it's a very useful tool during the selection process. For us at CDPQ, screening for GIPS and GIPS verification when looking for public equity managers, it's a real time saver. This is mainly the sector where we look for GIPS. But first, the first benefit, it's standardized performance presentation. So it provides comparable performance information, thereby improving the quality and speed of the due diligence. There's less internal verification and control we need to do. Of course, this is not always possible just because adoption of GIPS is not equal across managers. For example, GIPS is not as well known maybe in the hedge fund or private equity space, as Ken mentioned, or maybe sometimes in smaller firms with specific strategy or country focus. But as adoption increases, I think external managers might see the competitive edge of being GIPS compliant, and it's really helping to stand out. And asset owners will benefit as well from a more comparable level playing field in performance reporting. So now just a few slides on what becoming compliant to GIPS from an asset owner perspective looks like, and how maybe the 2020 standards are helping simplifying the process. On this page, we note that only 1 year, Ken, if I can ask you just to go to the next page. Perfect, thank you. We note on this page that only 1 year of historical performance is required. So this is new. So an asset owner that chooses to become compliant can start by just showing 1 year history. It could be even less if the asset owner is in the beginning of creating his historical record. So this is really helping simplifying the process of not having to port 10 years of historical performance into a GIPS standard presentation. So the GIPS report can be quite simple, and the report can also only present the total fund performance. So once this initial lift of being compliant is done, maintaining compliance is usually pretty streamlined, using the existing control and processes and documentation that most of the time are already in place in the different asset owners teams. So just a word on total fund. We illustrate on this page how the asset owner can present performance for one or multiple total fund. Basically, depending on the nature of the asset owner and the number of clients that are beneficiaries of the asset owner, you might have one total fund for just one client, one beneficiary, or multiple one. The total fund typically represents a specific investment policy with with a specific allocation. But this usually creates a very simple reporting package. On next page, we presented just a short example, and you can see total fund performance, gross net of fees, the benchmark return, standard deviation around the return. So this information is usually used already by the organization and already made available to management and client. And just as a final note, additional performance can also be shown. So for us at CDPQ, we show total fund performance, but we choose as well to present asset classes performance. So this is why we created composites, and this is the definition of composites. So it could be different asset classes, it could be different strategies. So it really gives the flexibility of the organization to present total fund, but as well some different strategies that we want to put forward. So hopefully this was a useful perspective on how GIPS 2020 can apply to asset owners and can benefit them. And I think on this, I'll turn it over to Emile.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for having us today. In my part, I will focus on provisions for the firm. And by firm, we mean discretionary portfolio managers that manage actual money either through funds or through segregated accounts. It is important to note that GIPS 2020 standards are asset class agnostic, and reporting in compliance with GIPS standards is based on a cross mix of vehicles, which are composites and pooled funds, and methodologies, which are time-weighted returns and money-weighted returns. Let's dive right into it, and we'll start with the vehicles. Firm is required to create a composite strategies offered to the segregated account clients. In other words, all discretionary fee-paying accounts must be included in at least one composite. On the other hand, firm is not required to create a composite for the fund or multiple fund strategies that are not offered to the segregated account investors. On our next slide, furthermore, GIPS standards differentiates between two types of funds. It's a broadly distributed pooled fund and the limited distribution fund. We'll start with the broadly distributed pooled fund. A broadly distributed pooled fund is the fund that is not offered exclusively through one-on-one presentation and also is regulated under a framework that would allow a general public to purchase units of this fund. The examples would include mutual funds and UCITS. On the other hand, limited distribution fund is simply any fund that is not a broadly distributed pooled fund. Examples would include a private equity fund, real estate fund, and so on. And if you find this confusing, you're probably not alone. You can think of it this way. If units of your fund are sold on an open market and you don't have a direct contact with each unit holder, then it's a broadly distributed pooled fund. However, if you have to meet with investors and present it to them, and sometimes even negotiate with them, then that would be a limited distribution fund. And on the next slide, we can now compare reporting requirements for each vehicle. Since limited distribution pooled fund and composite entails direct communication with the prospective investor or client, usually through one-on-one presentation, both will have a very similar requirements on providing GIPS reporting to prospects. In both cases, the composite and limited distribution pooled funds, firm must make every reasonable effort to provide the GIPS report to all prospective clients, investors, when they initially become a prospect, and every 12 months going forward, as long as the prospect remains a prospect. However, when it comes to broadly distributed pooled fund, since communication between the PM and investor is limited to none, firm is not required to provide a GIPS pooled fund reports to those prospective investors. On the next slide, Now that we've covered the vehicles, we can look at the methodologies. GIPS standards recognizes two methodologies, time-weighted and money-weighted. As mentioned earlier, GIPS is based on principles, and therefore, instead of requiring the firms when to use money-weighted returns, GIPS allow firms to choose to present money-weighted return if composite or the fund meets a certain criteria. And the most important one is the firm has the control over external cash flow. And the second could be one of either four listed below. It's either a closed-end fund, fixed life, fixed capital commitment, or includes a large portion of the strategy is illiquid investments. The end product of the firm's GIPS compliance is the creation of the GIPS report on the next slide. Reports in compliance with GIPS is based on the cross mix of two vehicles and two methodologies that we just covered, each with its own sets of requirements. Although there are a lot of similarities between them, GIPS pool fund reports have lesser data requirements that are specific for composites, for example, internal dispersion. However, in some cases, fund reports will have more disclosure requirements. This is why it's very important for the firm to have a full understanding of its own product line before creating and defining composites. GIPS 2020 also introduced, in my opinion, one of the greatest marketing tools available to the firms today, a carve-out. A carve-out is a portion of a portfolio that is by itself representative of a distinct investment strategy. And for example, if firm manages, let's say, a North American strategy, it could present its Canadian and US components as two separate standalone strategies. Because of its complex nature, there is a whole separate section dedicated to carve-outs and how to allocate cash and how to properly present and calculate the performance. One of the key requirements is that the carve-out must be representative of a standalone portfolio managed or intended to be managed according to the strategy. In other words, in the previous example of your North American strategy, if you have only one or two US holdings, it likely would not be qualified as a standalone strategy, but you can still do a carve-out for the Canadian ex-US portion of that strategy. And in the interest of time, we don't have to go over more details on the carve-outs, but if you're interested, feel free to submit your questions for the Q&A or contact the CIPC group for more guidance on carve-outs and other topics covered. I'm going to pass it over to Patrick, and I will be back with you in a few minutes for verification.
Thank you, Emil. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the GIPS presentation. So we decided to tag team Emil and myself for the firm part because in my experience with Fiera Capital, we always work end-to-end with our verifier. So that's why I thought that it was really a good idea to tag team with Emil because it's a day-to-day conversation with them during the audits, but not only during the audits, during as well across the year, because when we have a new strategy or a new acquisition, I don't know if you know well Fiera Capital, but we have growth with a lot of acquisition. We acquired firms and in some cases only some teams. So that's why I thought it was a good idea. So my part about portability, I thought it was a good subject to speak about because I started for Fiera in 2011, and 1 year after we decided to become GIPS compliant. So at that time, with the GIPS 2010 standards, we had to audit 5 years back. So we had to audit until 2008. But with the history of Fiera, with all the acquisition that we've done, it was not easy. It was a big project to do, and after that, with some years, so I can speak a little bit more about portabilities because in 2008 we acquired a team And with the 2010 standard, we had to bring the historical performance if the portabilities, the criteria were respected. So for sure, when you acquire a team, the goal is to after that to market the strategy. And if you can market the strategy with the GIPS report, and the longer history you have, it's easier to get more clients. So it was a big project. So basically, we have 4 criteria to meet when you have to bring the historical performance. First, you have to acquire the whole team. So not only the portfolio manager, but as well the analyst. And the decision-making process should remain the same. So you cannot change the process after the acquisition. As well, one of the most important, and by experience, I can mention it, one of the most difficult criteria that we have to meet is we have to have the record to support the performance. So depending of the relationship that you have during the acquisition, so if it's a firm or it's a team, you have to make it clear that you need the record to support the performance. So that means that you need the custodian report, the valuation report back in time. So so in 2010, if all the criteria were respected, you have to bring the performance. Now with 2020, you can take the decision if you want to keep the performance or not. So it's a little bit more flexible. And with that time, so I know that there is a lot of merging companies. Some people with COVID, some people change companies. So that kind of flexibility is a little bit more welcome, because for firm, for sure, if you want to present past performance, if it's more flexible, so it's more easy for you during that time of period. And the last criteria, the fourth one, for sure you cannot have a break during the performance. So if you want to chain link the performance, so the past performance with the live performance, I would say, you can have a break. So it's for everybody who work in performance, it's a gimme. So it's really simple. But if that happens, so you cannot changing the performance, but on a separate report, on one-on-one report, you can as well present the past performance, but not on your GIPS report. So I can say that by experience, I've done one in 2008, and I'm presently doing another portability test for another team that we acquired, and it's public. You can Google it. It's really a challenging project. It's really interesting to do, and it's really welcome that GIPS can allow to bring back the performance from another team, because the goal for a firm is to sell the strategy and to get clients. So if you have long history, it's easier to get clients. And when you acquire a firm or a team, it's because the performance is good normally. So it's really welcome. It's for anyone who want to speak with me about that project. If you are involved in that kind of project, I'm really open to have a discussion with you. But GIPS 2020, it's a little bit more flexible than it was in the past. But the 4 criteria are the same, but they must be respected for sure. On the next slide 24, so I can maybe speak about my experience about the advantage of being GIPS compliant. So when I started for FIARA in 2011, we were not, but I can see that now. First, one of the first things, so if you are GIPS compliant, you have to prove everything that you publish. So the performance, the composite report as well. So you have to have a strong process, a strong performance process. You have to build a policies and procedure. It's really important, and it's really welcome for client or future client. So this is one of the big advantages. So, and in my past life, I worked for a pension fund, Laval University pension fund, and have built RFPs because we had external managers. And one of the first questions was, are you GIPS compliant? So this is one of the first questions that pension fund asked for an external manager. And it's really important because that can give a lot of confidence to the client or the future client that you have big process, you have documentation, and you are not shy to be audited about all the operation that goes around performance. I can say that if any firm that think to be GIPS compliance, it's a very valuable stamp that you can have for getting bigger among time. So that was my part for that presentation. Thank you, Emil, for tag team with me. I will give you back the mic to speak about the verification. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And I used to say that stick with the standard script, whatever you see on the screen. Used to say that verification focuses on the firm's compliance with GIPS and everything that is required to maintain that compliance. Although it's a correct answer, but it's very dry and does not really add much clarity to it. So when it comes to verification, the verifier's responsibility is to ensure that the firm follows its own rules and on how performance is being calculated and presented. So here's a little bit of an example. GIPS principles state that all discretionary fee-paying accounts must be included in at least one composite, but it does not specify what the discretion entails. So if the firm adopts minimum account size rule for discretion, let's say $1 million, then we as a verifier must make sure that the rule applies consistently, meaning there are no accounts below $1 million minimum are included in any of the composite. So to put your minds in this, verification is not so much of ensuring that the firm has strict rules in place, but rather follow its own rules that it created internally. And I think that's enough said on verification. Is probably one of the most boring topics of the entire GIPS. So we might have some questions later on if you have more questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Emil. And thanks, Simon and Patrick as well. Before I dive into resources, I just wanted to mention that the GIPS standards themselves has some basic principles built into it. One is that the compliant entity, whether it's a firm or an asset owner, can't present any type of performance, even outside of a GIPS report, that is deemed to be false and misleading. Another basic principle is that the firm and asset owner must adhere to all applicable regulation regarding investment performance. And the reason I'm mentioning that, you may have heard, if they here where I'm based in the United States, the SEC has rules regarding marketing and advertising. And they recently revised those rules under what's called the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. Prior to these revisions, these rules, quite frankly, were written before many of us were born and before a lot of the current advertising mechanisms, such as social media, even existed. So this new rule in the SEC is pretty encompassing. It encompasses a lot of things on both advertising and solicitation. Included in that is updated rules on presenting investment performance when that performance is presented as an advertisement. So that's a long-winded way of saying if you market into the US, which you may not, and you may be subject to these new rules. And so we're conducting a webinar on this new regulation and the differences between the new SEC rules on marketing, which are going to be effective, and the GIPS standards. And that webinar will take place on June 8th, 11 a.m. US Eastern Time. So hopefully not too early in the morning for most of you. There'll be that webinar will be announced through our GIPS newsletter, which you'll see in the resource section how to subscribe to, and our website, gipsstandards.org. So again, that's my long-winded way of saying if your entity markets into the US, you probably want to take a look at and sign up for that webinar. So in terms of resources, key thing to know before we're going out of time here is we have a website, gipsstandards.org. We just actually redid the website. If you haven't taken a look at it recently, I encourage you to do so. Much better organized than it used to be, much easier to find things. Of course, if you still can't find anything, feel free to reach out to me and I'll help you find it so you don't spin your wheels. On the gipsstandards.org website, we have everything from a technical standpoint that constitutes authoritative guidance. So that's each edition of the GIPS standards, guidance statements and Q&As, and we have what's called the GIPS standards handbooks, if you're not familiar with that. Basically, those we have them for both GIPS standards for firms and GIPS standards for asset owners. And what that does is provide interpretive guidance for each provision within the respective GIPS standards. And as applicable, there'll be Q&As and examples, really hundreds of pages of goodness. A lot of firms and asset owners use this as a technical resource, regardless of whether they claim compliance with the GIPS standards. So I highly recommend that you take a look at the GIPS standards handbook. We also have a help desk, which not all standard setters have. It's done via an email box. It's gips@cfainstitute.org. And what that is, if you have a question on the GIPS standards, typically a technical question, but really any question that you have, just shoot us an email at gips@cfainstitute.org, and we'll try to get back to you within 3 business days. We get something out of this too, because we get to see what people are struggling with in the marketplace, and that really helps us when we go about updating the GIPS standards or putting together Q&As, which we do if we need to address something that hasn't been previously addressed. In addition to the standards themselves, which you can find on the GIPS website, we also have a service provider listing if you're interested in hiring a consultant or a verifier. We have loads of webcasts and videos and articles and that type of thing. We'll get to the GIPS standards newsletter. I think I mentioned the volunteer opportunities. So on the next slide, and I think Simon mentioned this, but on the GIPS standards website, you'll see the case study for an asset owner, in this case, AIA, coming into compliance with the GIPS standards. We also came out with a great new brochure explaining why you would comply and benefits of the GIPS standards for both asset owners and firms. That's available on the GIPS website, Introduction to the GIPS Standards, Increasing Transparency and Trust. We also are coming out with a series of videos. Each video is on a specific topic. The first video is on asset owners. It's called Introduction to the GIPS Standards for Asset Owners, and that's on the homepage of our website as well. We also just released an asset owner survey in the US market, but if you're a Canadian asset owner, you may be interested in that. So have a look out for that. We also, to the extent you're interested in hiring a verifier, whether you're a firm or an asset owner, have a suggested questions document. Basically, this could serve as your RFP when you're looking to hire a verifier. And most entities use this as a resource when putting together an RFP for hiring a verifier. We just updated those, and they're separate documents now, again, based on whether you're a firm or an asset owner. We also just updated what's called the model RFP template. You may have an interest in this. This document, although it's meant for the consultant community, it has examples of the right way and, quite honestly, the wrong way on how to ask questions regarding the GIPS standards. We continually hear from firms that they get a little frustrated because sometimes in a database or their consultant is asking about the GIPS standards, which is great. They're happy to check the box that they're compliant. Often this gives them a marketing advantage, they feel, but the question is being asked using old terminology. And this document is very helpful in that it provides the correct terminology and the correct way to ask those questions. If you're an asset owner and you're putting together an RFP, I highly recommend you take a look at that. We're also going to release in the next week or so what we call an assistance document. We have an assistance document for firms considering getting into compliance with the standards. We're in the process of updating that for the 2020 edition of the standards, but regardless, if you're a firm and you're thinking about getting into compliance, it's a great resource because it takes you through your policy options on getting into compliance with the GIPS standards and examples of actual policies. It's written by firms that got into compliance with the GIPS standards from their perspective on what they had to do to get in compliance. We're now going to have that document, or a separate document, if you will, assistance document, just for asset owners, and that document is going to be released in the next week or so. So if you're an asset owner, have a look out for that. Also, before I run out of time, I wanted to give a shout out for the GIPS standards newsletter. Well over 20,000 individuals subscribe to the newsletter. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, but you need to subscribe to it. And unfortunately, we can't do that for you. Like in the old days, you'd just be able to shoot me an email. Now you've got to subscribe by sending us an email, and then we can send you a link and get you registered, or you can do that up through our website. We are including more and more technical information as well as updated events. So the GIPS Standards newsletter includes a lot of things I would say that you'd probably want to keep abreast of, regardless of whether you're in compliance with the GIPS standards. So I heartily encourage you to subscribe to it if you haven't already. If you don't want to subscribe, but you just want to look at all the back issues, you can do so. They're housed up on our website. Again, cfainstitute.org. And with that, I think we're going to hand it over to David, who's going to run through some of the Q&As we've received so far. Questions, I should say. David, are you ready?
But Ken, I don't know if David is ready, but
there we are.
Sorry, maybe you're on mute. And I apologize. I learned the hard way. If I view the chat box, you all don't see the full version of the screen, so I can't see the chat box. So fire away.
No, and that's okay. That's why I'm here. I'll manage all the questions. So, as you know, for the questions, we've got a few ways to ask us questions. It's if you're able to use the chat box, drop us a question there. You can set up the question so that it's for everyone to see, or if it's a question that you want to ask kind of anonymously, without your particular name or firm attached, by all means, just send it as a direct message, and then that way only I see it, and I promise to maintain anonymity if that's the case. So with that, I'll get started. So the first one I'll direct to Simon, if I could. So Simon, does the asset owner that you work for undergo a GIPS verification? If so, can you tell us why you choose to be verified and speak to the verification process?
Yes, good question. Yes, we decided to be verified, and this goes back a few years now. I think I wasn't there in the early 2000s when we adopted, but verification started right then, and we've been verified ever since. So the benefits for us of verification is, first, it's really, it's an added layer of comfort and insurance that all the numbers are in line. There's no errors, that all the assets and all the investment activities are covered within the performance reports. So that's the first thing. It's very useful for management, the board, the clients to know that all the performance numbers within the GIPS report have been verified. But it's more than this. It really, it creates a partner between the firm and the verification team, just because it's a great challenge to make sure that all your processes are up to date, all the numbers are covered within the GIPS report. And that's the first thing. It's very useful for management, the board, the clients to know that all the performance numbers within the GIPS report have been verified. But it's more than this. It creates a partner between the firm and the verification team, just because it's a great challenge to make sure that all your processes your controls are best practice, you have your documentation. So, it's not required, but it's recommended. And for us, it really keeps the performance team up to date, and it creates a dialogue between the verification team and performance team that has great value for us.
Oh, thank you very much, Simon.
Yeah.
I'll direct this one. I think this one should go to Emil if I could. So what is it that managers would expect as a typical cost for pursuing verification? We know the benefits, but what would be the cost to determine if the benefit of it? Oh, I think you're on mute there, Emil.
Yes,
oh, there we go.
Yes, I was. Thank you. Absolutely. It is a very difficult question to answer. From my experience, I know majority of the verification firm on the market today have sort of a minimum base fee, and then build on that depends on the company's individual situation. So it could depend on the number of composites, number of the accounts the firm manages, and also the investment vehicles it uses. For example, verifying a fund that's using NAV strike by the third party is significantly easier than verifying a composite with a couple of hundred accounts in it. Lesser testing, and the NAV, since it's done by the third party as a verifier, we don't go into actual NAV evaluation itself. It's very hard for me to start to pinpoint exactly the cost. It depending on the company and depending on who you've been working with, it can vary very drastically. Again, when you are trying to select a verifier, like Ken mentioned, you should always interview a firm that you're talking to.
Okay, thank you. Going to move to the next question, and let's see. I'm not sure who this one would be best for, so I'll direct this to the panel. So the 2020 edition of the GIPS standards includes the updated version of the advertising guidelines. Can you speak to what those guidelines are and your experience working with them so far? And I would add, how would they contrast and compare to, let's say, Canadian standards?
Hi, this is Ken. I guess I can.
Oh, Ken,
I can start and say what the advertising guidelines are, and maybe Neil, you can then follow on with your experience, and then talk about the Canadian side, since I'm not based in Canada, I'm based in the U.S. So the advertising guidelines are voluntary, and the reason they are there basically, the reason how it had started was firms wanted the ability to advertise that they were in compliance with the GIPS standards. And so we provided the ability to do so, but there are certain, not really that onerous requirements of things that you must state in that advertisement if you're going to mention that you're in compliance with the GIPS standards. And I'll briefly just say that you do not need to, it's not required that if you advertise your firm or a product, that you mention that you're in compliance with the GIPS standards. But if you do so, there's one set of requirements just to mention that you're in compliance with the GIPS standards. Neil can go in that in more detail. And then if you choose to present investment performance, there's more requirements, including the time period, optional. You have to present certain time periods for the investment performance, and we present quite a few options as to what those time periods are.
Okay.
And I'll stop there. Emil?
Yes, and absolutely agree with Ken. Just want to take maybe a step back, and I would say the first step is the firm must recognize the difference between a one-on-one presentation and advertising. And one-on-one presentation are those the examples, the end product of the GIPS compliant or GIPS report, we call it nowadays, that's created for one-on-one presentation with customized fee schedule and everything. and advertising and marketing is something that goes to more than one prospect at the same time. For example, marketing your performance on your website. And second important, like Ken already mentioned, is that firm will only require to follow GIPS advertising guidelines if it mentions GIPS in that particular piece of advertising. So if you don't mention in GIPS on your website, you're not required to follow the requirements of the GIPS standards on certain disclosures. However, again, the requirements are so basic that everything that GIPS requires is probably already required by the local regulators, except of course the claim of compliance. And the last one, to answer your question, I wouldn't see GIPS 2020 to be anything revolutionary in terms of advertising guidelines. It was more of added clarification to what's already being practiced as a common practice. Like, for example, if there's a certain disclosures that became very important for the prospective client, for the prospective investor to be disclosed, it should be disclosed in advertising, even though if it did not make it to the to your GIPS report, if the event happened after the GIPS report was produced. So that's it.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I'll just add it conforms to the enhancements we made to the 2020 standards. So you can now look to see, whether you're advertising a composite or a fund. And now we don't have time to talk a little about this today, but particularly on the alt side, you can present money weighted returns, particularly since inception IRR. So we've addressed the periods of performance that need to be presented when you present an IRR in an ad. I mentioned the GIPS standards.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here. I see several benefits of the GIPS verification and compliance. Why not all money asset managers, or why don't all asset managers adhere to the GIPS standard? Whoever would like to tackle that one.
I can maybe mention something. So this is the goal of the CIPM. So the goal of the CIPM is to increase the number of asset owner and firm to be GIPS compliant. So this is why we are doing that kind of presentation today. But it's a really, really good question, why it's not mandatory to be GIPS compliant. For sure that costs money, for sure that it costs resources. But this is one of the goals of the CIPM to promote the good news, to the benefit to be GIPS compliant.
And I'll just add, and the others feel free to jump in. CFA Institute is a not-for-profit organization. So in this case, we play the role of a standard setter, but we're not a regulator. So we think it's important to come out with industry standards where necessary, and this is a perfect example of where they are necessary, but it's industry self-regulation. We wouldn't have the regulatory authority to require compliance with the standards, but we're hoping the industry adopts it. A large part of the industry adopts it, and we're hoping, through efforts like this from entities like the CIPC, that those firms that have not adopted it yet will come on board.
Okay.
And also to mention, I sometimes hear that firms believe that adopting GIPS compliance is such a huge project that they either don't have internal resources or they just unable to would not be able to handle it with what they currently have. And sometimes it's a question of a chicken or the egg for the startup firms. Do you want to build up your assets first and then go against GIPS compliance and get verified? Or do you want to get started, do things right from the start and build up your performance in compliance with the GIPS standards? So I see that some firms that decide to take the first route, they would have so many custom portfolios or custom strategies that they are at some point when they have this 5-year desired performance history which they want to market, they would not be able to create meaningful composites of the strategies that were intended, just because there was no proper rules placed in place at the first from this day one on how to maintain certain accounts and how to maintain the composites and strategies.
Thanks, Emil, and I'll just add, kind of to divvy off what Simon had said earlier. Asset owners play a critical role, and now that we have a GIPS standards for asset owners, we're seeing a large uptake in interest, not only for asset owners that are looking to get into compliance, but they're also increasingly looking at their third-party investment managers to claim compliance with the GIPS standards. And I think that will help nudge a fair amount of asset owners. At least that's what we're hoping to get into, nudge investment managers to get into compliance because their asset owners are asking for it.
Okay, so this question, just to kind of bounce off of what you had mentioned there, Ken. For an asset owner using third-party managers, do the third-party managers have to comply for the asset owner to comply?
Great question. Do you want me to take that, Simon, or did you want to take that?
I think that just a basic answer to this question is no. The asset managers don't have to comply to GIPS in order for the asset owner to comply. It's a plus for sure, just because all the benefits we mentioned, but it would be very difficult because, of course, there's asset managers that are complying. I mentioned earlier that there is some specific sectors or specific asset classes where GIPS is very, you see GIPS everywhere and most of the firms are complying. But for an asset owner that invests as well in funds, in private equity funds or in hedge funds, it would be very difficult to be compliant if all the different asset managers were to be required to be compliant. So no, there's no requirement for that.
And I'll just add, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but sometimes we get a similar question. Do you need to be a CFA charter holder or have a CIPM designation at a particular firm? Someone have it at that firm in order for that firm to adopt the GIPS standards? And the answer is no.
Okay. We have another question here, and this one is from our chat here for everyone. How do you see GIPS reporting evolving as we move forward? So from 2020 onward. I'll open that up to whomever would be.
I guess I'll start as the industry. We through organizations such as the CIPC and CFA Canada, and the work of many of our volunteers, we do our best to keep abreast of changes that happen in the industry, and we want to make sure that the GIPS standards continue to be relevant. And so we continually come out with Q&As or guidance statements as need be to address changes in the industry. So it's not like we just come out with the GIPS 2020 and that's it, and we don't do anything for 10 years. We do come out with new guidance as needed. One of the big areas that we've started to take a look at, I'm not sure how prevalent it is in Canada, but it's a huge thing in the US, is the use of OCIO managers by asset owners. So basically, a lot of asset owners have chosen, such as pension plans, but it doesn't have to be just a pension plan. It can be an endowment fund, for example, have chosen basically to outsource their investment management function, where historically, they may have managed all the assets internally or hired third-party managers. Instead, they hire an independent party that will do all that. And so we're thinking about whether OCIO managers, and many of which are interested in the GIPS standards and some of which comply already, whether we should have a GIPS standards for OCIO managers or a separate section. And that's an example of where the industry is changing and where the GIPS standards will need to evolve to keep up to date with that.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. So, and I've been sent the message, keep an eye on the time. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much Ken, Patrick, Simon, Emil, and thank you so much for including the contact information that you've put up on the slide there. As I understand it, we're going to be sending out the recording to those individuals who maybe weren't able to make it, and the contact information will be on there. I'm presuming as well that we will be sending out a questionnaire or survey just to make sure that we're hitting the mark. So we always want to hear, and this goes for Vancouver, Okanagan, Victoria, across the board. We always want to hear back from our membership.
I don't know if he froze for all of y'all as well. If he did, that's completely fine. Just to recap, thank you all so much for participating. Thank you to our panelists for showing up and providing the information that you did. Once again, this will be available to you after the fact, so make sure to watch out for that in your inboxes and the communication going forward if you're interested in seeing the replay for this event. And yes, I'll give you all back the rest of your Wednesday. Appreciate you joining us, and take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.